Alright, for today's critical thought, we're going to return to, Game Design 101, where they talk about pacing when it comes to game design and progression. For any kind of entertainment medium, having the proper pacing is critical to keeping your audience invested, and more importantly, keeping them from falling asleep or changing the channel. And we can talk about pacing in, again, just about any medium, from graphic novels, TV shows, movies, you name it. And we are certainly not going to be getting to everything in this video. But I want to focus on game design. Now, when it comes to pacing, progression and pacing usually go hand in hand when it comes to a game's development. And as we've talked about, progression is, of course, how the player, the character, and the game will grow or change over the course of an entire playthrough. Now, in previous critical thoughts, we've talked about the importance of proper progression. If the player is at this point 5 hours in, they should be like here later on, and they should never remain stuck in one spot. And also, they should never be put into a situation where there's no other form of progression other than one option, because that can usually lead to that sense of grinding. Now, when it comes to properly pacing your game, there's usually a few key areas we want to touch on. The first is the general gameplay itself, or specifically how the game will change and challenge the player from beginning to middle to end. And this is basically the first big challenge as a game designer. It's about being able to understand just what exactly I can challenge the player with or offer the player to do given my mechanics or systems in game. The more complicated your game is, the easier it is to extend or have more things to go for. If the only thing the player does in your game is run to the right, which again, camera being reversed there, you can't really do too much. Now, of course, you can certainly be creative and come up with interesting running mechanics and systems along those lines, but there's still an inherent limit. And we've talked about being able to understand just how much you can get out of your mechanics in an earlier critical thought. Now, with that said, being able to properly stretch things out and grow things is a hallmark of good design. And as we just said, there has to be a fundamental difference from beginning to middle to end in your game. If I'm just doing the same exact thing at 5 minutes in that I'm doing 50 hours in, the player is going to get bored and they're not going to feel invested in the mechanics. And as we said, some games you can really go the distance in terms of mechanics. The use of roguelike and procedurally generated design can do a lot in terms of replayability. But when it comes to properly pacing out your mechanics, this also comes into play with just what are you trying to test the player with. As we've said before, good design is about easing the player into new mechanics and systems and providing a scope or a sense of flow that allows the player to learn as they go along. You're not going to introduce the player to the hardest version of a mechanic the very first instance of it. And good examples of this would be games or the old school platformer genre, such as Mega Man, Mario, and the like. And again, we can certainly talk about Mega Man and Mario as great examples, and of course, Super Mario Bros. World 1-1. The point is, in these games, the pacing dictates the difficulty curve and progression of the levels. In the very first level of Mario Bros., you're not going to be dealing with too much in terms of tricky platforming and crazy enemy situations. Everything is introduced in its most basic form and in an order of importance. You're going to walk, you're going to see an object that you can jump and hit, there'll be a lone enemy, there'll be little tests in terms of jumps, and at worst, I think the hardest thing on the first level is like a gap that's like this big for Mario to leap over. And even that comes near the very end of the level. Now, when it comes to understanding the complexity of your game and pacing that out, that is a major topic in of itself, and one we could easily spend the next 15-20 minutes on. But it's important to understand just the not only the order of utility, but the order of complexity when it comes to your game. Going back to Mario, for instance, in the Galaxy series, the game, while it gives the player all of Mario's moves from the very beginning, it doesn't test the player on all those. And that's a really big point. You can give the player all manner of abilities and options, but for a new player, they will only understand what you are actively teaching them. And as we've talked about with Mario Galaxy, the design does a really good job of pacing itself for both novice and skilled players. And we've talked about this with also games like Snake Pass as well, and the idea of subjective difficulty, in that you have the normal player's difficulty curve through the game starting out like down here, while the expert player starts like right up here and then goes up from here. And what this does is that both players are being tested based on their own knowledge, but the game is still building in terms of pacing out the challenges. And it is really good and really smart game design to be able to understand what is considered the novice version of my mechanic, what's considered intermediate, what's expert, and what's, super pro min maxing top, 2% of my player base playing. Because you need to be able to balance your game and pace it out in such a way. And as we've talked about before, being able to establish that baseline in terms of just what you're expecting the player to do in your game is critical for pacing. As we've seen in many games, especially from the Mario series and Nintendo, they don't go completely over the top. They will never, or you will never see in a main Nintendo or main Mario game, difficulty on par with stuff like Kaizo levels or Super Dram World or stuff along those lines. Because while that it is very difficult and very challenging, it's far beyond the scope of what Nintendo wants to test the player base on. And not only that, but it's such a unique form of difficulty that you can't really pace that in the sense that testing the player on being able to double jump or spin jump and the like. And the same goes for being able to pace out enemy designs. And again, for each one of these topics, we could spend easily 15-20 minutes per. But to briefly go over it, when it comes to pacing enemies, it's always about, once again, testing the player's knowledge of the game. You're not going to throw a grandmaster enemy who can counter everything the player does in the first hour of play. You're going to grow things out and introduce things gradually. And again, you can see this in a lot of action-based games where they'll always introduce the generic scrub enemies or the disposable goons kind of thing. Then they may introduce like a lieutenant or something a little bit heavier, sometimes as a mid-boss, or sometimes as the end of a level boss, but it will always be on their own. And then once again, it's up to the designer to properly pace out just how much they want to test the player's mastery of these systems and of the enemy's design. Because as we've said, when it comes to extremes in game design, either the very, very easy or the very, very hard, it's very easy to design those. Because if we're going for very easy, just lower the enemy's health, give them like 1 point of damage, and you're done. If you want to make something very hard, boost it completely to the opposite and make an enemy who in one punch does 800 points of damage. But again, a hallmark of a good game designer is being able to scale and pace things out over the entire length of whatever their game is, be it a 3-hour game, 10 hours, 50, and so on. And when it comes to enemy designs, you have to properly pace it with what the player is learning. You're not going to introduce a boss or an enemy that's going to test the player on knowledge that they haven't been exposed to yet in their game. Likewise, if we're near the end of the game, I shouldn't be fighting level 1 enemies. I should be expecting to fight enemies that are on par with what I'm at that given stage. And like I said, this kind of pacing is very hard to get right, and it does require a lot of playtesting. And the example that I want to talk about and to start to wrap up today's critical thought with is what I've been playing with the Yakuza Kiwami and even Yakuza 0. Now, the Yakuza series is again a combination of RPG and action based gameplay. And it definitely falls more on the RPG side of things when it comes to its pacing. These games can take easily 40 to 50 hours to go through. But the problem that I've had with both of these games is that it doesn't really get the pacing right when it comes to combat. There are cases where one enemy or one boss fight is going to be harder than all the other fights that are coming up in like the next 30 minutes to 2 hours of play. And again, if we start getting into design talk, we could easily spend another 15 minutes on this video. But playing through Yakuza Kiwami, a really good example again of not properly pacing the game is that the game doesn't really educate the player on the finer points of its design, especially in the differences and various moves that are corresponding to the different styles you have access to. In fact, here's a really good point. In the original Yakuza 0, or what came out I think earlier in 2016, 2016 it came out, whenever it introduced a new style for the player to use, it actually taught the player a little bit about what made that style different. Either being able to absorb damage, pick up weapons without needing to, or pick up weapons while you're attacking, stuff like that. In Yakuza Kiwami, there is no tutorial message about those specific fine points. And again, as I've said before, you always have to assume that every video game is somebody's first. And it's important to get that tutorial and proper understanding down. Because you don't want to introduce information that the player has no idea even exists in the game. And we've seen that in other titles where specific mechanics or rule sets are never referenced in game, yet are critical for learning the title. And when it comes to pacing your game out, you have to once again figure out just what order do I want to explain things in. And with Yakuza Kiwami, again, there's a lot in terms of how things work and how to properly grow and learn these games that the game makes no reference or even hints at that there are these different rules. And again, I could spend another 3-4 minutes and we go into some examples, but I'm going to wrap things up here for today. So to summarize today's critical thought, when it comes to pacing in a video game, you have to understand just how much you can get out of your mechanics, as well as what you're going to test the player on. Because a good progression curve is always going to be a gradual incline, not, peaks and valleys and go in like this. The player should not be struggling in a level 3 fight and then find levels 7 through 10 to be a cakewalk. Everything should be growing in complexity and difficulty, even if your game starts out on the harder side or the easier side from the get-go. You always have to grow and expand your mechanics and systems out. Because as we said, if everything just comes to a standstill, the pacing of the game becomes shot, and it becomes a lot harder to keep players engaged when there's just nothing to keep them going. Be it having nothing but fights and the story gets pushed to the wayside, or the player is forced to watch 3 hours of cutscenes before the next gameplay decision. For those of you watching this right now, can you think of examples of games that are really great in terms of their pacing, be it in terms of story, gameplay, or both? And have there been games that you've played where the pacing has utterly lost you, and that it just forced you to just stop playing the game out of disinterest? But thanks so much for watching today's Critical Thought. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back for daily discussions on game design here and on GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. Until next time, have a great day. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and come back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on game development, be sure to check out game-wisdom.com. Follow me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day. And to help support everything that I do, you can find me on Patreon under GW Bycer, or Game Wisdom. Your donations can help to keep things running, and we hit some goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy. So, thanks again for watching, and be sure to come back for daily discussions on game design on the Game Wisdom channel.